He came on a Tuesday. That was the detail that stayed with everyone who heard the story afterward. Not the strangeness of it, not the impossibility, but the mundane specificity of the day. A Tuesday. Weighing less than 4 pounds, pressed both his hands flat against the glass of a second-story window and held them there until the girl inside woke up. Isla Vega did not hear him. She never heard anything. But she felt the vibration, a faint trembling in the wooden floor beneath her bed, traveling through the frame of the house the way sound travels through bone. She opened her eyes before she understood why. She lay still for a moment in the way that people who cannot hear have learned to do, receiving the world through surfaces and pressure and the invisible trembling of air. Then she turned her head toward the window. He was looking directly at her, not at the glass, not at the trees behind her, at her. She was 9 years old, and in 9 years she had seen many animals in the forest at the edge of her family's property. Monkeys in the canopy, flickers of brown and black moving between branches 40 feet above the ground. She had never seen one at the window of her house. She had never seen one sit perfectly still, both hands pressed to the glass, watching her with the patient, deliberate intensity of something that had been waiting. She told herself later that she had not been frightened. The monkey stayed for 4 minutes. She counted. Then he dropped from the windowsill and was gone. That was the first morning. Her mother disappeared on the 4th. What happened in the days between, and what that small creature knew that no adult in that house thought to ask, would take years to fully understand. But by the time people in the town of Huayrapuva pieced together the whole story, there was only one thing everyone agreed on. The monkey had chosen Isla, not her mother, not her grandmother, not the neighbors or the rangers or the search teams who would come later with radios and maps. He had gone to the window of the one person in that house who experienced the world the way he did, through pressure and proximity and touch. And he had stayed until she opened her eyes. What no one knew yet was why. She had learned the language of silence, which is different from quiet and much harder than any spoken tongue. It is a language of hands and faces, and the particular angle of a body when it is trying to say something it cannot say with sound. Marisol had never been a naturally expressive person, a woman who measured ingredients exactly and folded laundry in a specific sequence and drove the 14 kilometers to town on a schedule she kept in a handwritten notebook. She spoke carefully, choosing words the way someone might choose tools from a box, an insistence that whatever she gave you was exactly what she meant to give and nothing less. When Isla was 18 months old and the hearing tests came back the way they did, Marisol drove home from the clinic in silence and sat in the car outside their house for 11 minutes before going inside. Her husband Thomas was waiting at the door. He had taken the day off work, and they sat together at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. That was the last time in Marisol's life that silence felt like loss, because what happened next was that she began to learn. Not just sign language, which she started classes for the following week. She learned everything else too. She learned how to alert Isla to her presence by touching her shoulder first, never startling her from behind. She learned which parts of the floor vibrated when someone walked in the kitchen and which parts did not. She learned that Isla could feel the bass frequencies of certain music. And on Saturday mornings, she put a Bluetooth speaker face down on the kitchen table and let it hum while they ate breakfast. And Isla would press her fingers to the wooden surface and close her eyes and smile. There was a time in those early years when Marisol had worried about the wrong things. She had worried about Isla's education, about whether the right school existed in a region like this. These were legitimate concerns, and she addressed them with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else, researching programs, visiting schools in Cusco twice, writing letters to a specialist in Lima whose name appeared in every article she found, about childhood hearing loss in Peru. But the thing she had not predicted was how quickly the world would accommodate. In the quiet, incremental way that communities accommodate someone they love. The Quispy family, who lived nearest, learned 20 signs by the end of Isla's first year. The woman who ran the small shop in town, Donna Pilar, had taken it upon herself to learn the signs for all the items she sold. And by the time Isla was 7, going to the shop with her mother was one of Isla's favorite things, because Donna Pilar would sign every item while she packed it into the bag, performing a small inventory in 2 languages. And she always saved the sign for chocolate for last, presenting it with the gravity of a person who knows she is doing something important. By the time Isla was 4, Marisol could hold an entire conversation in sign language without pausing to think. By the time Isla was 7, Marisol had begun teaching the neighbors. Not formally, but in the organic way that things spread in small communities, and ask how she was doing and tell her to be careful. There was one other thing Marisol had acquired, somewhere in those 9 years of learning: a bracelet. It had come from Isla's godmother, a woman named Renata, who lived in Arequipa and visited twice a year, bringing things she thought were beautiful, each one the size of a fingernail, each one producing a slightly different tone when they moved against each other. Renata had bought it at a market in a town she had passed through and had given it to Marisol almost as an afterthought, pressing it into her hand when she left, saying only that she had found it beautiful and thought Marisol would too. Marisol had put it on that afternoon and had not thought much about it. The bells were too quiet to hear in a room with any other sound in it, but Isla could feel them. When Marisol held her hand, Isla could feel the tiny vibrations passing through her mother's wrist, a continuous, almost silent conversation between the metal and the air. The first time it happened, Isla had been 4 years old. She had taken Marisol's hand in both of hers and pressed her fingers to the bracelet and gone very still, and her face had done something that Marisol had no word for, something between recognition and relief. The second morning, the monkey came earlier. Isla was still asleep when the vibration woke her, stronger this time, and when she looked at the window, he was there again, both hands on the glass, watching. This time she got out of bed. She walked to the window and stood close enough that her breath fogged the cold glass, and she looked at him the way you look at something you are not sure is real. She put her hand flat on the glass, the same way he had his hands. The vibration of his palms was barely perceptible, a warmth and a trembling that had nothing to do with temperature. She was 9 years old, but she stayed there for a long time after he left, her hand still on the glass where his had been, feeling the cold where the warmth had already faded. She did not tell her mother. She tried to understand why later, and the closest she could come was this: some things feel like they belong only to you in the first moments, before language and explanation change what they are. She was 9, and something had pressed its hands to her window twice, and she wanted to hold it privately for a little longer before it became a story. She would spend years wishing she had told her mother that morning, but she did not. He had grown up in a household where money was measured precisely and sentiment was considered a luxury to be indulged only after necessities were secured. His father had worked in the mines and had retired early with lungs that no longer fully cooperated, and watching that had given Tomas a clear sense of the distance between work and health and the choices that sat between them. He had trained as a geological technician, where other industries had nothing to offer. He had married Marisol when they were both 29, at a small ceremony in her mother Carmela's garden, and the love between them was the kind that is not easily described because it did not perform itself. It was present in the specificity of what they knew about each other, in the way Thomas always set the coffee to brew before Marisol woke up, and she always turned down his side of the bed before he finished his evening reading. It was present in the way they had sat together at the kitchen table after the hearing tests came back, and in the way he had, without discussion, immediately enrolled in the same sign language classes she had found. Years later, described to a friend in simple terms. He said, "I was afraid I would not know how to love her the right way. And then I understood that the right way was just the only way. You pay attention, you show up, you learn." He had learned. By the time she was 6, he had begun picking up nuance, the difference between her signs for confused and uncertain, which used the same hand shape but different facial grammar. He had a notebook too, like Marisol, though his was less orderly, filled with his own sketches of hand shapes and their meanings, drawn in the margins of work schedules and grocery lists. That kept him company on the 2-hour drive to the house. He did not open it. He just knew it was there, arranged in the particular configuration that she used when she was frightened and refusing to show it. She had been a primary school teacher for 31 years and had learned during that time that certain expressions caused more panic than they prevented. She greeted Tomas at the truck and spoke quietly while Isla was still inside. Marisol left at 7:15. She is not at the trail edge. She would not have gone further without better light. Tomas nodded. He went inside to find Isla. She was at the kitchen table with the map, the property map, and the forest access map, the one Marisol kept pinned to the corkboard next to the door for reference. Something close to concentration, like a person working on a problem. He went to her and held her and felt her hands press against his back, at particular checking pressure, and then she pulled back and signed. She went in this morning. I saw her go, but the monkey was there again. He was moving, not sitting still. Try to sleep if you can. She is experienced. She has supplies. This was something that visitors often did not expect. They expected the hush of something ancient and tucked away from the world, and instead they found a continuous soft percussion, the drip of condensation from moss to ground, the creak of branches under weight, the distant threading call of a nightjar working its way along the ridge. The sound did not carry the way sound carries in open country. Felt as much as heard, a low continuous vibration in the chest. Inside the house, Isla felt it. She lay in her bed with one hand pressed flat on the wall beside her and felt the house breathing, felt the particular frequencies of the forest at the edge of the property, and somewhere beneath that, something that did not have a category in her experience. A pattern of contact, pressing and releasing. The window pane again, at 4 a.m, in the dark. She went to the window. He was there. This time she stood close enough to touch the glass with her nose, and she watched him in the dark. He was visible only because of the pale wash of light from Aurelia's porch across the field, and what she could see was not calming. He was rocking slightly, weight forward and back, and both hands were moving against the glass in a pattern that was not random. Then he looked past her, at the door of her room, which led to the hallway, which led to the stairs, which led to the back door, and the forest beyond it. She followed his gaze, though she could not see past the door. When she looked back, he was looking at her again. A sudden weight of knowing that resided below the level at which she normally processed information. She had felt this weight once before, when she was 6. She had not heard the dog, but she had felt the urgency through the floor, through the glass, through the particular tension in the air that changes when something with a nervous system is in distress. She was feeling it now. She stood at the window for another minute, looking at the monkey, both palms flat against the glass. Then she went and put on her field boots. She did not go outside. She understood, even at 9, that the forest at 4 a.m. was not a place for her alone. But she went downstairs, and she stood at the back door, and she looked toward the tree line. She turned on the small kitchen light and spread the map flat and looked at it the way she had been looking at it all evening. She knew this map. She had been on the flagged routes with her mother many times. She knew where the paths went and where they turned and where the open ridge was and where the stream crossed. She could read this map the way she had learned to read everything, completely and without skipping. She found the second route, the one her mother had been planning to take today, which she had mentioned at dinner 2 evenings ago, and which Isla had remembered because her mother always said where she was going and what she expected to find, as if narrating her own days into Isla's visual field to compensate for the ambient context that Isla couldn't absorb passively. She put her finger on the second route. She moved it slowly along the orange-marked line. Then she moved it off the line. 30 meters. Not a large distance. Not a meaningful distance on a regional map. But she moved it, slowly, to a section where the topographic lines clustered closely together, and she held her finger there and felt something she could not name, the same pressure behind her sternum, the same weight of a certainty that had not passed through thought. She did not mark the map. She did not wake Carmela. She went back to her room and lay down in the dark and pressed her palm flat against the wall and waited for the morning. She did not go outside. She understood, even at 9, that the forest at 4 in the morning was not a place for her alone. And somewhere in the dark, at the edge of her vision, she could see a small shape moving between the fence posts and the first row of trees. Moving and stopping. Moving and stopping. She had not known that Carmela was awake. Her grandmother had been awake since midnight, developed a sensitivity to the sounds of children in distress that functioned independently of her conscious state. She had not heard Isla, who had made no sound, just far enough for someone small to look through. She had gotten up. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Isla standing at the back door, one hand on the frame, looking toward the tree line. The kitchen light was off. The only light came through the windows, the cold gray of a cloud-covered mountain night. Carmela had raised 2 children and taught hundreds. She knew the difference between a child who was frightened and a child who was listening. Isla was listening. She did not intervene. She went to the kitchen table and sat down in the dark and waited. Carmela watched her trace the line with her finger. Back and forth, from the marked route to the section east of it, 30 meters of topographic detail that most adults would not have thought to examine. That the most important thing she could give a child was the experience of being believed. Not of always being right, which was impossible, but of being believed long enough for the testing to happen, for the truth to emerge or fail to emerge on its own terms. She had seen what happened to children who were not believed, who learned early that their perceptions required external validation before they were allowed to act on them. Those children became adults who could not trust themselves, and that was the most expensive kind of damage because it compounded across a lifetime. She said nothing because Isla could not hear her anyway, and because the saying would have been for her own comfort, not for Isla's. When Isla finally put her finger on the drainage section and held it there, Carmela got up and went to stand beside her. Isla looked up at her. Carmela put her hand on Isla's shoulder and squeezed once, firmly. The one that was not an official sign, the one that meant simply, "I hear you." Then she went to call Tomas. The morning came slowly, which mornings in Cloud Forest always do. Tomas had been awake since 5, and Aurelio arrived at first light with his younger brother Rodrigo, who was 17 and very quiet, and who knew the secondary trails better than anyone because he spent his free time. He had a printed version of his own map, which was more detailed than Marisol's in certain sections, and he spread it next to the property map on the tailgate of Tomas's truck while they talked. They planned 3 search lines: the flagged route, an extension of it further into the forest along the ridge, and a 3rd line that followed the drainage terrain where the topographic lines clustered. This 3rd line had been Tomas's suggestion, because Marisol knew that section and would have avoided it. He found out later when Carmela told him. But by then it was already over, and the knowing of it arrived in the context of everything else that had happened. And its effect was not surprise, but something much more difficult to name. They planned 3 search lines. The flagged route, an extension of it further into the forest along the ridge. Rodrigo had said nothing about the 3rd line when Tomas suggested it. He had looked at the map and then at Tomas and nodded, and had drawn the line on his own printed map with a careful pencil mark. He was 17 and had spent 3 years mapping the secondary trails in this section of forest on his phone application, an activity he had told no one about because he had learned early that the things he was most genuinely interested in were not easily explained and were therefore easier to do quietly. His mother thought he was playing games. His brother Aurelio thought he was texting. He was, in fact, building an increasingly detailed picture of the terrain, adding elevation data and drainage notes and seasonal variation logs, and the locations of specific tree species. He knew the drainage area, the area on his map with a symbol he used for terrain that required caution. When Tomas said the drainage area, Rodrigo had looked at the map and felt something settle into place in his understanding. Not surprise, the absence of surprise. He was the one later, when the account was assembled, who said something that no one had thought to include, that the drainage section Isla had pointed to was the exact section he had marked with his caution symbol. The exact section, not approximately the same area, but the same coordinates, within a margin of 10 meters. He had not shown Isla his map. They had not discussed the terrain. She was 9, and he was 17, and their acquaintance consisted primarily of polite greetings at the property fence. He said later that he did not know how to explain that part of it. He said, "I know that area. I know why it would catch someone. It is the one section that looks safe from a distance, but is not safe at all." She pointed to the one section that would have done this. He paused. He said, "I do not have an explanation. I only know that she was right." This became the part of the story that Rodrigo told for the rest of his life when people asked him about the rescue. Not the monkey, exactly. The map. Marisol had been in the drainage channel for 16 hours by the time the morning search began. She had passed the first night in the way that people who work in field conditions learn to pass difficult nights, with her attention divided precisely between what was essential and what was fear. What was fear? Everything else. She had allowed herself to feel the fear in the way that she had learned to allow Isla to feel difficult things, completely and without flinching, and then set it to the side. It did not disappear. It stayed near her, a companion she had not chosen, but she did not let it make her decisions. Not because the cold worsened, though it did, or because the ankle was more painful, though it was, but because those are the hours in which the mind, deprived of task and company, begins to negotiate with itself in ways that daylight hours do not permit. She thought about her father, who had died when she was 26. She thought about the clinic appointment where the audiologist had explained the hearing tests to them, how the woman had been careful with her words. She thought about the moment in the car afterward when she had sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before going inside. She had told herself in those 11 minutes that she was composing herself, preparing herself to be calm for Tomas, being responsible about the transition from what she had hoped to what was true. What she had actually been doing, she understood now, in the forest in the dark. She had been sitting in a parking lot, grieving a child she had not yet had a chance to know. A version of Isla who heard things, who would never exist. She had never told anyone this. Not Tomas, not her mother. She felt the bells. She thought, Isla is awake. It was not a deduction, not an inference from anything she could observe. It was simply a fact that arrived, the way certain facts about people you love arrive, fully formed and not requiring argument. She thought, she is awake, and she is already moving toward me, in whatever way she can move toward me from where she is. She held the bells still and felt them vibrate against the pads of her fingers, and she thought about a small creature pressing its hands to a window in the dark, feeling the frequency travel through the glass, choosing the one person in the house who would understand. She did not tell herself that this was rational. She only knew it was true. To the trees and the moss and the silence, and whatever was listening in the particular dense quiet of a place that is alive all the way down to its roots. The monkey had not left the area. This was the detail that she had not expected, and that she returned to many times in the years after. She had assumed, after he went ahead of her and she began to move, that he was leading her, that she would follow him to the edge and she would be found, threading between the channels with his uncanny certainty about which ground held and which did not. But when she stopped to rest, which she had to do every 20 or 30 meters, because of the pain and the effort and the wet cold that had settled into her hands, he stopped too. He did not wait ahead of her, visible and beckoning. He sat near her. Twice he sat close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, which she did not do, because she understood, in the way you understand things about wild animals that you have spent time observing, that the proximity was something he was extending and not something she should test. And in the looking, there was something she was not prepared to describe, even to herself, while it was happening. Of reading communication in behaviors that are simply biological. She knew all of this. Looking back at her with amber eyes that held the particular quality of attention that she had only ever seen in one other creature, and she did not know what to do with that. The one other creature was her daughter. The quality was this, not curiosity, which is general and sweeping, but specific and continuous attention to one particular thing. The kind of attention that does not wander, because it is not interested in wandering. At the glass of a window from the inside. The monkey looked at her bracelet. He looked at her face. She started moving again. She stopped to rest after the second hour, which had been bearing most of her weight, had developed a deep ache that went up into the hip. She thought about the first morning she had brought Isla to this forest. Isla had been 5. Marisol had been worried about it, in the way she worried about many things she anticipated ahead of actually doing them. She had worried that Isla would find the forest disorienting, without the ambient sound that orients most people in enclosed spaces. The directional information carried in echoes and reverb, the sense of scale that comes from hearing how far away something is. She had worried that without those cues, the forest would feel confusing or frightening to a small child who relied on a different set of inputs entirely. What had happened was the opposite. Isla had stepped into the forest and stopped. She had pressed one hand to the trunk of the first large tree they came to, a moss-covered cedar at the path edge, and she had stood there with her eyes closed and her palm flat on the bark for almost a full minute while Marisol waited, not sure what was happening, but understanding that something was. Marisol had not known what that meant, exactly. She had asked Isla to show her, and Isla had taken her hand and pressed it to the bark, and Marisol had felt it then, barely, the very low, slow vibration of a living tree, the circulation of water through wood, completely present to a child who had spent her entire life learning to read the world through her palms. The forest sang to Isla. That was what she had meant. That the channel being closed had not left Isla in silence. It had left her in a different kind of reception, one that accessed things that sound would have drowned out. She had never forgotten that. She sat now with her back against a tree she could not name in a drainage channel she could not fully see, with a broken ankle and cold hands, and she thought about her daughter pressing both palms to a tree and closing her eyes, and she thought, she already knows. She is already awake. She pressed her fingers to the bracelet. She held the bells still and felt them. Then she started moving again. What she did not know while she moved, what she had no way of knowing, was the sequence of events happening at the house, which was running parallel to her own story, the way parallel lines do, in the same direction and never touching until the very end. Carmela had woken Tomas at 5:15. She had found Isla not in her room, but at the kitchen table again, her field boots already on, her hands on the map, her face carrying the same expression of concentrated certainty it had worn the night before. In the dark, alone, and found her way back to the map. She had called Tomas. When he came downstairs, Isla did not look up immediately. She was tracing something on the map with one finger back and forth between the second flagged route and the drainage section 30 meters east. It was the expression that meant, "I know something. I cannot explain how I know it. Please believe me." He had looked at the map. He had looked at his daughter. He had nodded. She pressed her finger to the drainage section. Here. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to wake Aurelio. They found her at 7:43 in the morning. Tomas had taken the drainage line himself, with Rodrigo reading his phone map ahead of him, stepping carefully, calling Marisol's name into the still air every 30 seconds, and listening for a response that did not come for a long time. Then it came. Her voice, from somewhere ahead and to the right, not strong but precise. The voice of a person who has been conserving everything they have and is now deploying it at exactly the right moment. "Here. I'm here." She had dragged herself 50 meters through the dark, with her ankles secured in the rain jacket from her pack, and she had made it to the tree line because she could see the lighter sky through the branches, and she needed to believe in it. Tomas knelt in the wet grass and put his arms around her without speaking. Isla was standing at the back door when they brought her mother out of the trees. She had been there for an hour. Carmela had tried twice to bring her inside, and she had stood her ground both times with the particular, courteous immovability of a child who knows exactly what she is doing and does not require help doing it. When Marisol came through the trees, supported between Tomas and Rodrigo, her green jacket still on and the pack still slung across one shoulder because she had refused to leave it, Isla walked toward her without running, without urgency, in the measured, careful way of someone approaching something fragile and real. Marisol saw her and stopped. They looked at each other across 15 meters of wet morning grass. Then Isla signed something, one-handed, the hand she was not pressing to her chest. The sign was simple. It was a sign that could mean safe or home or you, depending on context. One of those foundational signs that carries more weight than its component parts suggest. Marisol signed it back. Not the relief. The moment his daughter and his wife signed the same word to each other across a field in the early morning after a night that had contained everything terrible. And the word was the one that meant all three things at once. 2 titanium plates and several weeks in a boot, and then months of careful rehabilitation in which Marisol walked the path from the back door to the garden and back, over and over, measuring her own progress in increments small enough to make impatience difficult. She was not, by nature, an impatient person, but she had things to get back to, the forest routes, the research, the Saturday mornings with the speaker on the table and Isla's fingers on the wood. The surgery had been performed by an orthopedic surgeon in Cusco named Dr. Aguilar, a compact woman in her 50s who had the particular quality of attention that distinguishes excellent surgeons from good ones, as though she had calculated the precise number of words and movements required for any given situation and eliminated all excess. She had come to see Marisol the morning after the operation, not to assess the surgical outcome, but to ask her a question. Marisol had said she understood. What she had understood, lying in the hospital bed with her leg elevated and the bracelet on her wrist and the bells silent in the still air of the room, was something Dr. Aguilar had not been asking about. She had understood that for the rest of her life, whenever she thought about what motivation meant, she would think about 400 meters, about dragging herself across wet moss in the dark, following a primate the size of a house cat toward a light she could not yet see, because on the other side of the tree line there was a child in field boots standing at the back door, waiting. That was the protocol, not the physical one, the one she would follow for the rest of her life. She came home from the hospital in Cusco on a Thursday, 10 days after the rescue, and when she came through the front door, Isla was waiting in the hall. She was wearing the same field boots. The way you check something you love to make sure it is still real. She smelled of the hospital, of antiseptic and clean linen, and the particular neutrality of air that has been recycled through climate control. Isla held her longer than she usually held anything. Then she stepped back and looked at her mother's face, scanning it the way she scanned everything, completely and without embarrassment, reading the information that was there without filtering it through what she hoped to find. She signed, "You look tired." Marisol laughed, which surprised them both, because it was a laugh she had not expected to produce, and that came from somewhere genuine. She signed back, "I am tired. I am also completely fine." Isla considered this. She signed, "Both of those can be true." 9 years old, and already the person she was going to be, already carrying the clarity of perception that the world had given her in compensation for what it had taken. Later that evening, when Marisol was settled in the living room with her leg elevated, then she opened her eyes and signed slowly. "He came every morning. He showed me things. I did not know what he was showing me until I did." Marisol looked at her daughter's face. She said out loud, because sometimes the old channel still had things to offer, "Tell me everything." And Isla, who was 9 years old and who communicated in a language built entirely from what could be seen and felt and touched, signed the whole story. The urgency of the third morning, the way he had looked at the forest, and then at her, and then at the forest again, while her mother's green jacket disappeared between the trees below. She signed, "I should have told you. I thought it was only mine." Marisol looked at her for a long time. She signed, "It was only yours. That is why it worked." The room held this. Nobody spoke for a moment, because there was nothing to add to what had just been said. Some things, when they are true and spoken fully, do not require agreement or elaboration. They only require the space to settle, the way heavy things settle, slowly and completely. The rangers who managed the protected area adjacent to the Vega property were notified through the formal channels, because the story had reached them through the informal ones. The way all significant stories in small communities travel, the rangers were interested, professionally and personally. A juvenile capuchin making extended contact with a human household was not common behavior. Either the animal had been partially habituated to humans, which raised its own questions, or something about the situation had produced an outlier response that was worth documenting. They found trace evidence, fur on the fence posts, prints in the mud at the property boundary, the remnants of something eaten in the lower branches of the tree closest to Isla's window, suggesting he had been using that tree as a resting point. But no one found him. A biologist named Fernanda, attached to the same university program that employed Marisol, came out and spent 2 days in the forest and the adjacent property with a camera trap and a notebook. The behavioral pattern described is consistent with a juvenile male capuchin in the process of establishing range, specifically the second-story northeast window of the Vega property, over a period of at least 4 days, prior to the recovery event. The mechanism driving the repeated window contact is unknown. The animal was not observed during the survey period. What the report did not say, because it was a scientific report and not the place for it, was what Fernanda had observed during her time on the property. She had not seen the monkey, but she had spent one morning watching Isla in the garden, unbeknownst to Isla, from the far side of the fence, watching how this child moved through a world without sound, how she pressed her hands to things, how she stood at the fence line looking toward the trees. That she understood something about why a creature that reads the world through touch might have found this child specifically. might have returned to her window specifically. In a house with 3 other people, 2 adults and 1 visiting grandmother, this was the one who was already there. A 30-minute drive on a road that switched back along the edge of the ridge before dropping into the valley where the town sat. She had been going there since she was 6, one of 2 deaf students in a school of 300, and her interpreter. Veronica was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they were made for rather than trained toward. She had a quality of lateral attention, the ability to track a room from the corner of her eye, while her hands translated what was being said, that most interpreters spent years developing and that she had arrived with. She noticed the change in Isla the day she came back. It was not visible in any single thing. Isla did not look different, did not sign differently, did not behave in any way that another teacher or student would have identified as unusual. Careful accuracy she always brought to academic work. But Veronica, who had spent 2 years learning to read the quality of this child's stillness, noticed that it had changed texture. The stillness was not the stillness of someone waiting for information. It was the stillness of someone who already had it. In the classroom that morning, during a quiet work period, Isla sat with her hands flat on the desk surface, her eyes closed, her head tilted very slightly to one side. It lasted approximately 5 minutes. The other students did not notice. Veronica watched from the edge of the room and did not interrupt. Then Isla opened her eyes and began to write. Veronica leaned over to see what she was writing, expecting the assignment. What she found was a single sentence, written in Isla's careful printed English, which was her second language and which she was still developing. The sentence read, "He felt what she felt. That is how he knew where to go." Veronica read it twice. She looked at Isla. Isla was looking at her, not waiting to be praised or corrected, waiting to be understood. Veronica thought about it for a long moment. She thought about what she knew of the story, which was what everyone in town knew by then, which was most of it. She thought about the specific claim the sentence was making, which was not a claim about the monkey's intentions or motivations or anything mystical, but a much simpler and, she thought, more unsettling claim, that connection travels in the same direction as attention. She had spent 2 years interpreting for a child who pressed her hands to every surface she encountered, reading the world through the part of the nervous system that never went to sleep. Then she picked up her pencil and completed the assignment, and the morning continued the way mornings do, ordinary and unremarkable, the world organizing itself around what had just been said and then moving on. Veronica kept the piece of paper. She did not ask Isla for permission. She folded it small and put it in her pocket, and later she transferred it to the notebook she kept at home, the one where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. Veronica said, "I think it means that some forms of perception are not located in the individual. They are located in the frequency between. And if 2 things are tuned to the same frequency, it doesn't matter what separates them." The journalist had written this down. Then he had looked up and said, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." Veronica had said, "I interpret language all day. Language is the thing that happens on top of communication. I spend a lot of time thinking about what is underneath." There is a version of this story in which someone explains the monkey. In that version, capuchins are known to be among the most tactily sensitive primates. Their hands evolved to read surfaces the way a blind person reads text. In that version, the bells on Marisol's bracelet produced a vibration in a frequency range that foraging capuchins encounter in certain insects and hollow wood and moving water, a frequency range that means something is happening. Pay attention. A juvenile ranging through new territory, carrying no established fear of this particular house, might stop at the tree line and feel that frequency coming from the direction of the forest and follow it. A glass pane transmits vibration. The bells on the bracelet moved inside the house, and the glass conducted the frequency outward, faint, barely perceptible, but present, a signal that the animal had already associated with the place where that signal had originated. And the child at the window sat still in the same way her mother sat still. This version makes sense. It accounts for the behavior without requiring anything beyond the observed capacities of the animal and the known physics of vibration and glass. The people who knew Isla did not find this version unsatisfying. Exactly. They found it incomplete, not because of the window contact or the behavior in the forest, or even the circling of the drainage area, which could all be addressed by the framework above. Because of the map, pointing to a section 30 meters off a marked trail, and was correct. She had not been in the forest. She had not seen the terrain. She had not received any verbal or written account of where her mother had gone. She had only felt a small primate pressing his hands against her window in the dark, looking from her face to the forest and back again, insistent in a way she could not have named but could not misread. And she had gone to the map. And she had found the place. How she found it is the question no one has answered to their own satisfaction. Isla, when she was older, when she was 15 and then 20 and then in her mid-30s, and people still asked, always gave the same answer. Not an explanation, not a theory. And when the morning came and she was gone, I had already been feeling it for 4 days. The feeling knew before I did. She would pause, and then she would say, I think that is all it was. 4 days of the same signal until it had a shape I could read. Tomas kept the map. He had it framed, eventually, a simple white frame from a shop in Cusco, and he hung it in the hallway of the house where it remained for many years. It was just a laminated topographic sheet, printed from the university database, with Marisol's orange pen markings tracing the routes and one penciled circle around the drainage area. And in the lower right corner, in Isla's careful printed English, a single word, here. Visitors to the house would stop in front of it, often not knowing what they were looking at, drawn by the oddness of a framed map in a hallway, the kind of thing that makes you feel there is a story. And there was always someone present who would tell them. The monkey, the window, the boots on the table, the map. And the visitor would look at the word in the corner, here, and they would look at the circle and understand, without being told, that it was not just a location on a map, that it was the word a 9-year-old girl had used to tell her father in the language she was still learning where her mother was waiting. Here, not lost, not gone, here. Isla was 15 when she began writing in a notebook she kept in her desk, in a language that mixed Spanish and English, and sign language glosses in a way that was not designed to be read by anyone else. It was not a diary. It was something she did not have a name for, the way you sometimes do not have a name for the thing that is most important to you. She wrote about the forest, about the monkey, about the map in the morning and her mother coming through the trees with the emergency. She wrote about the bells. She wrote about what it meant to live in a world that communicated through a channel that was not available to her, and about what had opened in its place. There was one entry, written when she was 15, that her mother read years later. She handed him the notebook and watched his face. And I was the one he could tell. Some animals, and some people, the entry continued, are built to read the world from the inside of it. Not from above it, not through explanation or language, but from within the frequency of it, in the range where touch and knowing become the same thing. I have always been one of those. I thought it was a limitation. I do not think that anymore. The last time anyone at the Vega property saw the monkey was the morning of Marisol's 43rd birthday, 3 years after the rescue. It was early, before breakfast September. Marisol was in the garden, which had become her habit since returning from the hospital, sitting with her coffee and watching the tree line. It was about the quality of attention that the forest at morning required. His coat was fuller than she remembered, the amber eyes the same. He was no longer a juvenile. He had grown into himself. Marisol went still. He looked at her in the way she remembered. Not scanning, not curious in the roving, distracted way of animals, investigating something new. Focused, present, the specific, particular attention of a creature that knows what it is looking at and has decided to look at it completely. She reached up and touched the copper wire and felt the bells move against each other, their vibration traveling through the wire and into her palm, the same frequency that had been there every morning for 9 years. That had been there in the forest in the dark when she pressed her fingers to it and thought of Isla. That had been there in the recovery room when she came out of the anesthesia and needed, before anything else, to know it was still present. The monkey looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. He did not move for what felt like a long time. A morning light came through the cloud cover, diffuse and gray and soft, and the garden held its particular silence. Then he turned and walked back along the wall and dropped into the trees and was gone. She sat in the garden after he had gone. She turned the bracelet on her wrist and let the bells move, feeling them, the way she had felt them every day for 9 years, in all the different contexts that a life provides. At the kitchen table, in the operating room, the reminder that learning something fully means you never really stop. She sat there, and the morning continued around her. And after a while, she heard the back door open, which she could hear, and she did not need to turn around to know who it was. Isla came out of the house and stood on the path and looked at the tree line. An atmospheric pressure that came before anyone spoke or signed or moved toward each other. She had known her mother was in the garden before she came outside, and she had known something had happened, not how or what. Marisol did not sign anything immediately. She was looking at the tree line, and the bells on her bracelet were moving, and the garden was quiet. Then she reached up and took Isla's hand and held it, so the bracelet was between them, the copper wire against both their palms, the bells trembling their silent signal into both their hands at once. Isla pressed her fingers to her mother's wrist. The thing that had no name in Spanish or English or any signed language she had ever encountered, frequency of a copper bracelet that had been given almost by chance and worn every day without knowing why. She stood there until she understood what she was feeling. And then she opened her eyes, and her mother was looking at her, and neither of them needed to say anything, because the thing that had passed between them had not traveled through words. Through the specific frequency that existed at the boundary between sound and touch, in the range where one became the other, in the channel that had always been open between them. Years later, when someone asked Isla how she had found her mother, she pressed 2 fingers to her chest, right where a tiny hand had once knocked. She said, "He felt what I feel, and he came to tell me." Then she paused. I think some things do not leave just because you stop seeing them. The bells on the bracelet moved. The morning held its silence. And somewhere in the cloud forest, in the gray-green light of a September that looked like every September before it, and would look like every one that followed, something moved through the moss-hung trees with a certainty that required no map. It had felt it.